The scorching Georgia sun beat down mercilessly on Whitmore Plantation in the summer of 1861, casting long shadows across the cotton fields where 40 enslaved souls toiled under the watchful eyes of overseers. Among them was Abigail, a 28-year-old woman whose spirit had been forged in the fires of unimaginable suffering, yet remained unbroken despite years of brutality at the hands of Master Jonathan Whitmore. Abigail had been born into bondage on this very plantation, the daughter of Sarah, who had died when Abigail was merely 12 years old. Sarah's death had not been from natural causes. She had been beaten to death by Whitmore's father for the crime of trying to protect her daughter from the master's unwanted advances. That day had planted the first seeds of rebellion in young Abigail's heart, seeds that would grow into a burning desire for freedom and justice. Now, 16 years later, Abigail stood tall at nearly 6 feet, her muscular frame a testament to years of backbreaking labor. Her dark eyes held an intelligence that terrified the overseers, for they recognized in her the dangerous combination of natural leadership and barely contained rage. The other enslaved people looked to her for guidance, sensing in her the strength they desperately needed. Master Jonathan Whitmore was a man of 35, having inherited the plantation from his father 3 years prior. Unlike his father, who had been content with the standard brutalities of slavery, Jonathan possessed a sadistic streak that seemed to grow stronger with each passing month. He took particular pleasure in devising new forms of psychological and physical torture, always careful to stop just short of killing his property. After all, dead slaves produced no cotton. The plantation itself sprawled across nearly 2,000 acres of prime Georgia farmland, with a grand white mansion sitting atop a hill overlooking the slave quarters below. The quarters consisted of 20 ramshackle cabins, each housing 2 to 3 families, in conditions that would have been deemed unsuitable for livestock. The contrast between the opulent mansion and the squalid living conditions of the enslaved was a daily reminder of the vast chasm between master and slave. On this particular July morning, the tension that had been building for months finally reached its breaking point. Whitmore had announced the previous evening that he intended to sell 3 of the enslaved families to a plantation in Alabama, separating parents from children and husbands from wives. Among those to be sold was Samuel, Abigail's husband of 5 years, and their 4-year-old son Moses. "You can't take them," Abigail had pleaded with Whitmore the night before, swallowing her pride and begging for mercy she knew would not come. "Please, master, they're all I have left in this world." Whitmore had laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that echoed through the study of his mansion. "You forget yourself, Abigail. You have nothing. You are nothing. You exist solely for my benefit. And if I decide that your husband and child are worth more to me in Alabama than they are here, then that is where they will go. But Moses is just a baby," Abigail had continued, tears streaming down her face. "He needs his mother. The boy will learn to work just as you did," Whitmore had replied dismissively. "And perhaps separation from you will make him more compliant. You've always been too willful, Abigail. I won't have you poisoning the boy's mind with ideas above his station." That night, Abigail had lain awake in her cabin, listening to the soft breathing of her sleeping family, knowing it might be the last time she would ever hear those sounds. The rage that had been simmering within her for years finally boiled over, and she made a decision that would change the course of history for everyone on Whitmore Plantation. She began to move quietly through the quarters, waking the other enslaved people one by one. To each, she whispered the same message: "Tomorrow we take our freedom. Tomorrow we show them what happens when you push people too far." Not everyone was immediately willing to join her cause. Years of conditioning and fear had taught them that resistance meant death, and many were terrified of the consequences. But Abigail was persuasive, and more importantly, she offered them something they had never dared to hope for: a real chance at freedom. "Listen to me," she whispered urgently to a gathering of 20 enslaved people in the largest cabin. They're going to keep taking our families, our children, our lives, piece by piece, until there's nothing left of us. We can die on our knees as slaves, or we can die on our feet as free people, but I'd rather live as a free woman. Old Thomas, who had been enslaved on the plantation for over 50 years, shook his head sadly. Child, you don't know what you're talking about. They'll kill us all if we try to fight back. And even if we succeed, where would we go? They'll hunt us down like animals. The war has started, Abigail replied, referring to the civil war that had begun just months earlier. The Union soldiers are fighting to end slavery. If we can get to their lines, we'll be free. But we have to be willing to fight for it. And what about the master? Asked Rebecca, a young woman who worked in the mansion's kitchen. He's got guns, and so do the overseers. How do we fight against that? Abigail's eyes hardened. We use their own weapons against them. We know this plantation better than they do. We know their routines, their weaknesses. And we have something they don't have, the desperation of people with nothing left to lose. Slowly, one by one, the enslaved people began to nod their agreement. They had all suffered under Whitmore's cruelty, had all lost family members to his sadistic whims. The prospect of revenge, combined with the possibility of freedom, proved too powerful to resist. "What's your plan?" asked Samuel, Abigail's husband, who had been listening quietly from the corner. Abigail took a deep breath before outlining the strategy she had been formulating in her mind for months. "Tomorrow is Sunday. The overseers will be drunk from Saturday night, and Whitmore will be sleeping late. We strike at dawn, when their guard is down. We take the weapons from the overseers' quarters first. Then we deal with Whitmore." "And then what?" asked Thomas. "Then we burn this place to the ground and head north. We follow the North Star until we reach Union lines. Some of us might not make it, but those who do will be free." The group spent the rest of the night planning, assigning roles and discussing contingencies. Abigail would lead the assault on the mansion, while Samuel and several others would secure the weapons. The women and children would be responsible for gathering supplies and preparing for the journey north. As dawn approached, Abigail felt a strange sense of calm descend upon her. She had spent her entire life being told that she was property, that she had no rights, no dignity, no worth beyond her ability to pick cotton and bear children. But in this moment, she felt more human than she ever had before. She was about to take control of her own destiny, regardless of the consequences. The first rays of sunlight were just beginning to peek over the horizon when Abigail gave the signal. Moving with the stealth born of years of avoiding the master's attention, the group of rebels crept through the plantation grounds toward their respective targets. Abigail herself headed directly for the mansion, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. In her hand, she clutched a kitchen knife she had stolen from the mansion's kitchen weeks earlier, waiting for this moment. As she climbed the stairs to Whitmore's bedroom, she thought of her mother, of all the friends and family members who had suffered and died under the Whitmore family's cruelty. The door to the master's bedroom was slightly ajar, and Abigail could hear his heavy breathing from within. She paused for just a moment, knowing that once she crossed this threshold, there would be no turning back. Then, thinking of her son, who was scheduled to be sold that very day, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. Jonathan Whitmore lay sprawled across his massive four-poster bed, still wearing the clothes from the previous evening's drinking session. Empty bottles littered the floor around the bed, and the room reeked of alcohol and sweat. For a moment, Abigail simply stood there, looking down at the man who had controlled every aspect of her life for as long as she could remember. He looked smaller somehow, less imposing than he did when he was awake and wielding his power over others. In sleep, he was just a man, a cruel, sadistic man, but still just flesh and blood like anyone else. Whitmore stirred slightly, perhaps sensing her presence, and his eyes fluttered open. For a moment, confusion clouded his features as he tried to process the sight of one of his slaves standing in his bedroom. Then, as awareness dawned, his face contorted with rage. "What the hell are you doing in here?" he snarled, starting to sit up. "Get out before I—" His words were cut short as Abigail lunged forward, the kitchen knife flashing in the morning light. Years of suppressed rage and grief fueled her movements as she struck again and again, each blow a declaration of her humanity, her right to exist as something more than property. When it was over, Abigail stood over Whitmore's still form, breathing heavily. She felt no satisfaction, no sense of triumph, only a grim determination to see her plan through to completion. The hardest part was yet to come, leading her people to freedom through a hostile landscape filled with those who would kill them on sight. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the other rebels carrying out their assigned tasks. Shouts and gunfire echoed across the plantation as the overseers, caught off guard and still drunk from the previous night, tried desperately to regain control of the situation. Abigail wiped the blood from her hands and walked to the window, looking out over the plantation that had been her prison for 28 years. Soon it would be nothing but ashes and memories, and she would be free. The sound of gunfire erupted across Whitmore Plantation as Abigail's carefully orchestrated rebellion exploded into violent reality. From the mansion's second-floor window, she could see her fellow rebels moving with purpose through the grounds, their years of enforced subservience replaced by the deadly efficiency of people fighting for their lives and freedom. Samuel led a group of 6 men toward the overseer's quarters, where the plantation's weapons were stored. The head overseer, Marcus Briggs, had stumbled out of his cabin at the first sounds of commotion, still drunk and disoriented from the previous night's revelries. He barely had time to register what was happening before Samuel's group overwhelmed him. "Where are the keys to the gun cabinet?" Samuel demanded, pressing a stolen knife to Briggs's throat. "Go to hell," Briggs spat, even in his compromised position, maintaining the arrogance that had made him so hated among the enslaved population. Samuel's response was swift and final. The overseer who had whipped countless slaves, who had separated families and crushed spirits for sport, would never hurt anyone again. The other overseers, hearing Briggs's death cry, began to emerge from their quarters, but they were met with a coordinated assault that left them little chance to organize a defense. Meanwhile, Rebecca and 3 other women had infiltrated the mansion's kitchen and pantry, gathering supplies for the journey north while also securing additional weapons. The cook, Mrs. Henderson, a free white woman who had always treated the enslaved people with particular cruelty, cowered in the corner as Rebecca methodically collected knives, food, and anything else that might prove useful. "Please," Mrs. Henderson whimpered, "I never did anything to hurt you people." Rebecca paused in her work, fixing the woman with a cold stare. "You never did anything to help us either. You watched us suffer and said nothing. You're just as guilty as the rest of them." The systematic nature of the rebellion was a testament to Abigail's planning and the desperation of people who had nothing left to lose. Every aspect of the plantation's operation was being dismantled simultaneously, from the destruction of records that documented their enslavement to the liberation of tools and supplies that would aid their escape. In the fields, the remaining enslaved people who had initially been too frightened to join the rebellion were now faced with a choice: flee with Abigail's group or remain and face the inevitable retribution that would come when word of the uprising reached the authorities. Most chose freedom, swelling the ranks of the rebels to nearly 40 people. Old Thomas, despite his earlier reservations, found himself caught up in the momentum of liberation. He had lived his entire life under the yoke of slavery, had seen his wife sold away 30 years earlier, had watched his children grow up knowing they would never be free. Now, in what might be his final years, he was being offered a chance to die as a free man. "Burn it all," he told the younger men who were dousing the slave quarters with lamp oil. "Burn every reminder of what this place was." The plantation's main house, with its white columns and grand facade that had symbolized the wealth built on human suffering, was already beginning to smoke as fires were set in multiple rooms. Abigail had made sure that Whitmore's body would be consumed in the flames, erasing the physical evidence of her act while ensuring that the symbol of their oppression would be reduced to ash. As the rebels gathered in the main courtyard, Abigail emerged from the burning mansion carrying a bag of supplies and weapons she had collected from Whitmore's study. The sight of her silhouetted against the flames with blood still staining her clothes was both terrifying and inspiring to those who had followed her into rebellion. "Is it done?" Samuel asked, though the answer was written clearly on his wife's face. "It's done," Abigail confirmed. "Whitmore will never hurt anyone again. But this is just the beginning. We have maybe 2 hours before someone notices the smoke and raises the alarm. We need to be far from here by then." The group had swelled to 38 people, ranging in age from 4-year-old Moses to 70-year-old Thomas. They carried what supplies they could, but Abigail knew that speed would be more important than provisions in the hours and days to come. Every moment they delayed increased the chances of being caught by slave catchers or Confederate patrols. "Which way do we go?" asked James, a field hand who had joined the rebellion despite having a relatively easier life than some of the others. Abigail pointed north toward the distant tree line that marked the beginning of the Georgia wilderness. "We follow the North Star. The Union Army is somewhere up there, and that's our only chance of true freedom. But I won't lie to you. The journey will be harder than anything we've faced here. Some of us might not make it." "Better to die free than live as slaves," declared Rebecca, echoing the sentiment that had driven them all to this point. The group began their exodus from Whitmore Plantation as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting their shadows long across the ground they had worked for so many years without compensation. Behind them, the plantation burned, sending a column of black smoke into the clear Georgia sky that would soon alert the entire county to what had transpired. As they walked, Abigail found herself thinking about the magnitude of what they had accomplished. In the space of 2 hours, they had completely destroyed one of Georgia's most prosperous plantations, killed its owner and overseers, and liberated nearly 40 enslaved people. It was an act of rebellion that would send shockwaves throughout the South and inspire other enslaved people to consider their own paths to freedom. But she also knew that their actions would bring swift and brutal retaliation. Every white man in the county would be mobilized to hunt them down, and the punishment for successful slave rebellion was always death, usually preceded by torture designed to serve as an example to others who might harbor similar thoughts of freedom. The first few miles of their journey took them through familiar territory, land they had worked and knew intimately. But as they moved deeper into the wilderness, the terrain became more challenging and their knowledge less certain. Abigail had studied the stars during countless nights of planning, and she was confident in their general direction. But the specific route would have to be determined as they traveled. By midday, they could hear the distant sound of dogs barking, a chilling reminder that their pursuers were already on their trail. Slave-hunting dogs were trained to track human scent, and Abigail knew that their large group would be relatively easy to follow through the wilderness. "We need to split up," she announced during a brief rest beside a small stream. "A group this size is too easy to track. We'll divide into 4 groups of about 10 people each, and each group will take a slightly different route north. We'll reunite at the Chattahoochee River in 3 days." The decision to split up was agonizing for people who had found strength in their unity, but Abigail's strategic thinking was sound. Smaller groups would be harder to track and could move more quickly through difficult terrain. If one group was caught, the others might still escape. Samuel volunteered to lead one of the groups, taking with him several of the younger men who could move quickly and fight if necessary. Thomas, despite his age, insisted on leading another group, arguing that his knowledge of the local area would be valuable. Rebecca took charge of a group consisting mainly of women and children, while Abigail led the remaining group, which included her son Moses and several of the most vulnerable members of their party. As the 4 groups prepared to separate, Abigail gathered everyone together for what might be their final moment as a unified force. "Remember," she told them, "we're not just running away from slavery, we're running toward freedom. Every step we take is a step toward a life where we control our own destiny, where our children can grow up as free people. That's worth any sacrifice, any hardship we might face. The groups embraced each other, knowing that some of them might never meet again. Then, with heavy hearts but determined spirits, they set off in their different directions, each carrying with them the hope of freedom and the memory of their successful rebellion against the system that had oppressed them for so long. As Abigail led her group deeper into the Georgia wilderness, she could still see the smoke from the burning plantation rising in the distance behind them. It served as both a reminder of what they had accomplished and a warning of the forces that would soon be mobilized against them. The real test of their rebellion was just beginning. 3 days into their flight from the burning ruins of Whitmore Plantation, Abigail's group had covered nearly 50 miles through the treacherous Georgia wilderness. The journey had been a constant battle against exhaustion, hunger, and the ever-present fear of capture. Every sound in the forest could signal the approach of slave catchers. Every distant dog bark could mean their death. Abigail's group of 10 had been reduced to 8. Old Martha, who had been suffering from a persistent cough, had collapsed on the second day and refused to continue, insisting that the others leave her behind rather than risk capture. Young Peter, barely 16 years old, had fallen into a ravine during the previous night's march and broken his leg so severely that he could no longer walk. Like Martha, he had begged the group to abandon him, understanding that his injury would doom them all. The decision to leave behind their wounded companions had been the most agonizing of Abigail's life, but she knew that the survival of the group depended on making impossible choices. Each person they left behind carried with them the hopes and dreams of those who continued, and their sacrifice would be meaningless if the remaining members were captured. As they approached the predetermined meeting point at the Chattahoochee River, Abigail's heart sank. Only Rebecca's group was waiting for them, and they had been reduced from 10 to 6 members. The other 2 groups were nowhere to be seen, and the implications were terrifying. "What happened to the others?" Abigail asked as she embraced Rebecca, both women fighting back tears of exhaustion and grief. "Thomas's group was caught yesterday morning," Rebecca reported, her voice hollow with despair. "We heard the dogs and the gunshots. Samuel's group, we don't know, they were supposed to be here by now." The reality of their situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Of the 38 people who had fled Whitmore Plantation, only 14 remained at the meeting point, and there was no guarantee that Samuel's group would ever arrive. The slave catchers were closing in, and their pursuers had the advantage of horses, dogs, and intimate knowledge of the local terrain. "We can't wait any longer," Abigail decided, though the words felt like a betrayal of her husband and the others who might still be alive somewhere in the wilderness. "If we stay here, we'll all be caught. We have to keep moving north." The combined group resumed their journey, now following the Chattahoochee River toward the Tennessee border. The river provided them with fresh water and a means of masking their scent from the tracking dogs, but it also forced them to travel through more open terrain where they would be visible to any pursuers. On the 4th night of their flight, as they huddled together in a cave beside the river, young Moses began to cry for his father. The 4-year-old didn't understand why Samuel wasn't with them, and Abigail found herself struggling to explain concepts of life and death, freedom and sacrifice, to a child who should have been playing with toys instead of fleeing for his life. "Mama, when is Papa coming back?" Moses asked, his small voice echoing in the darkness of the cave. Abigail held her son close, feeling the weight of leadership and motherhood pressing down on her like a physical burden. "I don't know, baby, but Papa would want us to keep going, to find the place where we can be free." "I'm scared, Mama." "I know, sweetheart, I'm scared too. But being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you keep going, even when you are scared." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching along the riverbank. The group immediately fell silent, pressing themselves deeper into the cave as the sound of hoofbeats grew louder. Through the cave entrance, they could see torches flickering in the darkness, and the voices of their pursuers carried clearly across the water. "The trail goes cold here," one of the men was saying. "They must have taken to the water, spread out along both banks. commanded another voice, one that Abigail recognized with a chill of terror. It was Colonel Harrison Blackwood, one of the most notorious slave catchers in Georgia, a man whose reputation for cruelty was legendary even among the enslaved population. "We know you're out there," Blackwood called out into the darkness, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had never failed to bring back his quarry. "You can't run forever. Surrender now, and I promise you'll receive fair treatment under the law." The group in the cave knew that Blackwood's promises were worthless. Fair treatment for escaped slaves meant public execution, usually by hanging, designed to serve as an example to others who might consider rebellion. There would be no mercy for those who had killed their master and burned his plantation. For 3 hours, the slave catchers searched the area around the cave, coming within yards of the entrance on several occasions. The fugitives barely dared to breathe, knowing that the slightest sound could mean capture and death. Moses, sensing the danger, remained perfectly quiet in his mother's arms, displaying a maturity that no child should have to possess. Finally, as dawn began to break, the search party moved on, continuing their hunt further upstream. But Abigail knew that their respite would be temporary. Blackwood was persistent, and he had the resources to maintain his pursuit for weeks if necessary. "We need to change our strategy," Abigail whispered to Rebecca as they prepared to leave the cave. "They're tracking us too easily along the river. We need to go overland, even if it's more dangerous." The decision to leave the river meant abandoning their source of fresh water and their means of masking their scent, but it also meant they could travel through denser forest where they would be harder to spot. It was a calculated risk, but Abigail felt they had no choice. As they prepared to resume their journey, one of the group members, a woman named Sarah, who had worked in the plantation's laundry, approached Abigail with a troubling confession. "I can't go on," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "My feet are infected, and I'm slowing everyone down. You should leave me here." Abigail looked down at Sarah's feet and saw that they were indeed in terrible condition, swollen and bleeding from days of walking through rough terrain without proper shoes. The infection was clearly spreading, and Sarah was running a fever that was sapping her strength. "We don't leave people behind," Abigail said firmly, though she knew that Sarah's condition posed a serious threat to the group's survival. "You left Martha and Peter," Sarah pointed out. "This is no different. This is different because you're still able to travel, even if it's difficult. We'll find a way to help you." Rebecca had been listening to the conversation, and she approached with a grim expression. "Abigail, we need to be realistic. Sarah is right, she's slowing us down, and if she gets worse, she could compromise all of us." The moral weight of leadership was crushing Abigail. Every decision she made could mean the difference between life and death for the people who had trusted her with their lives. She had already been forced to abandon 2 members of their group, and the guilt of those decisions haunted her every step. "Give me 1 more day," Sarah pleaded. "If I'm not better by tomorrow, I'll stay behind voluntarily, but please don't abandon me now." Abigail agreed to the compromise, though she knew in her heart that Sarah's condition was unlikely to improve without proper medical care. They fashioned crude bandages from torn clothing and did what they could to clean Sarah's wounds, but their medical knowledge was limited and their supplies non-existent. As they resumed their journey through the dense Georgia forest, Abigail found herself thinking about the nature of freedom and the price they were paying for it. Every step north was a step toward liberty, but it was also a step away from everything they had ever known. The plantation had been a prison, but it had also been home. The people they were leaving behind, whether dead, captured, or abandoned, had been their family. The weight of these thoughts was almost unbearable, but Abigail forced herself to focus on the future rather than the past. Somewhere ahead of them lay the Union lines and the promise of true freedom. Behind them lay only death and a return to slavery. The choice was clear, even if the path was uncertain. As the sun set on their 5th day of flight, the group made camp in a dense thicket that provided good cover from any pursuing forces. They had covered another 15 miles, bringing them closer to the Tennessee border, but they were all showing signs of severe exhaustion and malnutrition. "How much further?" asked James, the field hand who had joined their rebellion despite his relatively comfortable position on the plantation. "I don't know," Abigail admitted. "But we keep going until we find the Union Army or die trying. Those are our only options." That night, as the group huddled together for warmth and comfort, Abigail allowed herself a few moments to grieve for all they had lost. Samuel might be dead. Thomas and his group were almost certainly captured or killed. The plantation that had been their entire world was now nothing but ashes. But they were still alive, still free, still moving toward a future that they would control. And that, Abigail knew, was worth any sacrifice. On the 7th day of their desperate flight through the Georgia wilderness, Abigail's group of fugitive slaves found themselves trapped in a narrow valley with no apparent means of escape. Behind them, the baying of bloodhounds grew steadily louder, while ahead the terrain rose sharply into rocky cliffs that would be impossible to climb, especially with young Moses and the injured Sarah slowing their progress. The group had been reduced to 12 survivors, having lost 2 more members during the previous night when they had been forced to ford a swollen creek in darkness. The cold water and strong current had claimed both victims before anyone could mount a rescue, their bodies swept away into the black Georgia night. "We can't outrun them anymore," Rebecca said, stating what everyone already knew. Her voice was hoarse from exhaustion and dehydration, and her clothes hung in tatters from their week-long journey through thorns and brambles. Abigail surveyed their surroundings with the tactical mind that had served her well during the plantation uprising. The valley was perhaps 200 yards wide, with steep sides that would provide some defensive advantage. A small stream ran through the center, offering fresh water, but also creating muddy ground that would slow any cavalry charge. Most importantly, there were large boulders and fallen trees that could serve as cover during a firefight. "Then we make our stand here," Abigail declared, her voice carrying the authority that had made her a natural leader among the enslaved population. "We've come too far to surrender now. If they want to take us back to slavery, they'll have to pay a price for it." The decision to fight rather than flee was not made lightly. Everyone in the group understood that their chances of survival were minimal. Colonel Blackwood's force included at least 20 armed men, along with tracking dogs and horses. The fugitives had only a handful of weapons taken during their escape from the plantation, and their ammunition was severely limited, but they also understood that surrender meant certain death, probably preceded by torture designed to extract information about other potential rebels. At least in fighting, they would die as free people, masters of their own destiny for the first time in their lives. "Mama, what's happening?" 4-year-old Moses asked, sensing the tension in the adults around him, but not understanding its significance. Abigail knelt down beside her son, taking his small hands in hers. "Some bad men are coming, baby. But Mama and the others are going to protect you, okay? I need you to be very brave and do exactly what I tell you. Are the bad men going to hurt us?" "Not if I can help it," Abigail replied, though she knew the promise was one she might not be able to keep. "Remember what I told you about being brave. Sometimes being brave means standing up to people who want to hurt you, even when you're scared." As the sound of their pursuers grew closer, Abigail organized the group's defenses with the same methodical planning that had made their plantation uprising successful. The women and children were positioned behind the largest boulder, where they would have the best protection from gunfire. The men took positions among the scattered rocks and trees, each armed with whatever weapons they had managed to acquire during their escape. Sarah, despite her infected feet and weakened condition, insisted on taking a fighting position rather than hiding with the non-combatants. "I've come this far," she said grimly. "I'm not going to cower behind a rock while others fight for my freedom." The first sign of their pursuers was the appearance of tracking dogs at the mouth of the valley, their handlers following close behind. Colonel Blackwood rode at the head of the group, his military bearing and expensive equipment marking him as a man accustomed to command and violence. "I know you're in there," Blackwood called out, his voice echoing off the valley walls. "This is your last chance to surrender peacefully. Come out with your hands up, and I give you my word that you'll be treated according to law." Abigail's response was to fire the single shot from the pistol she had taken from Whitmore's study, the bullet striking the ground near Blackwood's horse and causing the animal to rear in alarm. The message was clear. There would be no surrender. "So be it," Blackwood said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "You've chosen the hard way. Men, take them alive if possible, but don't hesitate to shoot if they resist." The battle that followed was brief but intense. The slave catchers had superior numbers and firepower, but the fugitives had the advantage of defensive positions and the desperate courage of people with nothing left to lose. For 20 minutes, gunfire echoed through the valley as both sides exchanged shots from behind cover. James was the first of the defenders to fall, struck down by a rifle bullet as he attempted to reload his weapon. His death cry galvanized the others, who increased their rate of fire despite their limited ammunition. Rebecca proved to be an excellent marksman, using a rifle taken from one of the plantation overseers to pick off two of the attackers, before a return shot shattered her left arm. "I'm hit," she called out, but continued firing with her good arm until her ammunition was exhausted. The tide of battle began to turn when Blackwood ordered his men to release the tracking dogs. The animals, trained to attack and subdue fleeing slaves, charged into the defensive positions with savage ferocity. Sarah, weakened by infection and fever, was unable to defend herself when one of the massive bloodhounds leaped upon her. Her screams echoed through the valley until they were suddenly cut short. "Fall back to the secondary position," Abigail ordered, recognizing that their primary defensive line was being overrun. The survivors retreated to a cluster of boulders near the rear of the valley, carrying their wounded and maintaining what defensive fire they could manage. But their ammunition was nearly exhausted, and Blackwood's men were closing in from multiple directions. The end was inevitable, and everyone knew it. The only question was whether they would die fighting or be taken alive to face the torture and public execution that awaited captured rebels. "Mama," Moses whispered, clinging to Abigail's skirt as bullets whined overhead. "I'm scared." "I know, baby," Abigail replied, pulling her son close while continuing to watch for targets. "But remember what I told you about being brave. You're being very brave right now." Udan, as the slave catchers closed in for the final assault, Abigail made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She had saved one bullet, intending to use it on herself rather than be taken alive. But looking down at her son, she realized that she couldn't allow him to be captured either. The fate that awaited a child of rebels would be too horrible to contemplate. "Close your eyes, Moses," she whispered, raising the pistol with a trembling hand. "Mama loves you very much." Ro. But before she could pull the trigger, the sound of gunfire erupted from an unexpected direction. Union cavalry, responding to reports of the chase, had arrived at the mouth of the valley and were engaging Blackwood's force from behind. The blue-uniformed soldiers had been searching for Confederate forces in the area when they encountered the slave catchers and immediately recognized the situation. "This is Captain Morrison, United States Army," a voice called out over the din of battle. "Lay down your weapons and surrender immediately." The arrival of Union forces completely changed the dynamics of the conflict. Blackwood's men, caught between the defensive positions of the fugitives and the attacking cavalry, found themselves in an untenable position. Some attempted to flee, while others tried to fight their way out of the trap. Blackwood himself, realizing that his situation was hopeless, made one final attempt to complete his mission. Spurring his horse toward Abigail's position, he raised his pistol and took aim at the woman who had led the rebellion that had cost him so much time and effort. "You'll hang for what you've done," he snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. But Abigail was faster. Using the last bullet in her pistol, she fired at point-blank range, striking Blackwood in the chest and sending him tumbling from his horse. The notorious slave catcher, who had terrorized the enslaved population of Georgia for over a decade, died in the mud of a nameless valley, his blood mixing with that of his victims. The battle ended as suddenly as it had begun. The surviving slave catchers either fled or surrendered to the Union cavalry, while the fugitives emerged from their defensive positions with a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming relief. "Are you the group that escaped from Whitmore Plantation?" Captain Morrison asked as he approached Abigail, who was still holding the smoking pistol that had killed Blackwood. "Yes, sir," Abigail replied, her voice steady despite the trauma of the past week. "We killed our master and burned his plantation. We were trying to reach Union lines." Morrison nodded, his expression showing both admiration and concern. "You've caused quite a stir throughout Georgia. The Confederate authorities have put a substantial bounty on your heads." "Are we free?" asked Rebecca, cradling her wounded arm. "As free as anyone can be in the middle of a war," Morrison replied. "You're under the protection of the United States Army now. No one will be taking you back to slavery." As the survivors of Abigail's rebellion were loaded onto army wagons for transport to Union lines, Abigail looked back at the valley where they had made their final stand. 7 of her people lay dead in the mud, their bodies testament to the price of freedom. But the remaining 5, herself, Moses, Rebecca, and 2 others, would live to see a world where slavery was nothing but a bitter memory. The rebellion that had begun with the murder of Jonathan Whitmore had ended with the death of Colonel Blackwood and the liberation of its survivors. It was a small victory in the context of the larger war, but for Abigail and her followers, it represented something far more significant: proof that enslaved people could fight for their freedom and win. 6 months after the bloody uprising at Whitmore Plantation, Abigail found herself standing before a congressional committee in Washington, D.C., her testimony serving as crucial evidence in the ongoing debate about the treatment of enslaved people and the conduct of the Civil War. The woman who had once been considered property was now addressing some of the most powerful men in America, her words helping to shape the future of a nation. The journey from the Georgia wilderness to the halls of Congress had been long and difficult. After their rescue by Union cavalry, Abigail and the other survivors had been taken to a refugee camp in Tennessee, where they had spent weeks recovering from their ordeal while military officials debated what to do with them. The legal status of escaped slaves was still uncertain in 1861, and the political implications of their violent rebellion had created complications that reached the highest levels of government. "Mrs. Abigail," said Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, one of the most radical Republicans in the House of Representatives, "please tell the committee, in your own words, what conditions were like on the Whitmore Plantation before your escape." Abigail, now dressed in simple but respectable clothing provided by abolitionists in the Capitol, stood with the same dignity that had made her a natural leader among the enslaved. Her son Moses sat quietly in the gallery, watched over by Rebecca, who had recovered from her wounded arm and had become Abigail's closest advisor and friend. "Congressman Stevens," Abigail began, her voice clear and strong, "the conditions on Whitmore Plantation were such that death seemed preferable to continued existence. We were worked from dawn until dark, fed barely enough to maintain our strength, and housed in conditions that would be considered inadequate for livestock. And the treatment you received from Master Whitmore himself. Jonathan Whitmore was a man who took pleasure in the suffering of others. He separated families for sport, sold children away from their parents as punishment, and devised new forms of cruelty whenever his mood struck him. On the day we rebelled, he had announced his intention to sell my husband and 4-year-old son to a plantation in Alabama, separating them from me forever." The congressman listened in silence as Abigail detailed the systematic brutality that had characterized life on the plantation. Her testimony was particularly powerful because she spoke not with the emotional hysteria that many expected from former slaves, but with the calm authority of someone who had lived through unimaginable hardship and emerged stronger for it. "Mrs. Abigail," interrupted Congressman Fernando Wood, a Democrat from New York who opposed the war and supported slavery. Are you asking this committee to believe that the murder of your master was justified by these alleged conditions? Abigail fixed Wood with a steady gaze that made the congressman shift uncomfortably in his seat. Congressman Wood, I'm not asking you to believe anything. I'm telling you what happened and why it happened. Jonathan Whitmore died because he refused to recognize our humanity. He treated us as property to be bought, sold, and disposed of at his whim. When a man reduces other human beings to the level of animals, he should not be surprised when they respond with the desperation of cornered beasts. But surely you understand that the law, Abigail interrupted, her voice rising slightly. What law protected my mother when she was beaten to death for trying to shield me from unwanted advances? What law prevented the sale of children away from their parents? What law gave us any recourse against the daily brutalities we endured? The law you speak of was written by slaveholders to protect slaveholders. It never protected us. The exchange highlighted the fundamental divide that was tearing the nation apart. To men like Wood, slaves were property, and their rebellion was theft and murder. To men like Stevens, they were human beings whose natural rights had been violated by an immoral system. Abigail's testimony was forcing the committee to confront the human reality behind the political abstractions. Mrs. Abigail, said Congressman Owen Lovejoy of Illinois, what became of the other members of your group? We understand that not everyone who fled the plantation survived the journey to Union lines. Abigail's expression grew somber as she thought of the friends and family members who had died during their desperate flight to freedom. Of the 38 people who left Whitmore Plantation, only 5 reached safety. The others died fighting for their freedom, were captured and executed, or perished during the journey through the wilderness. Each of them paid the ultimate price for the chance to live as free human beings. And do you believe their sacrifice was worthwhile? Congressman Lovejoy, every person who died during our escape died as a free person, not as a slave. They died fighting for something they believed in, not cowering under the whip of a master. Yes, their sacrifice was worthwhile because it proved that enslaved people will fight for their freedom when given the opportunity. The testimony continued for several hours, with Abigail providing detailed accounts of the plantation uprising, the flight through Georgia, and the final battle with Colonel Blackwood's forces. Her words were being transcribed by stenographers and would later be published in newspapers throughout the North, where they would help galvanize public opinion in favor of immediate emancipation. But the most powerful moment of her testimony came when Congressman Stevens asked her about her hopes for the future. Mrs. Abigail, if the Union prevails in this war and slavery is abolished, what do you hope to see for yourself and your son? Abigail was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. Congressman Stevens, I hope to see a world where my son can grow up knowing that his worth as a human being is not determined by the color of his skin. I hope to see a world where children are not born into bondage, where families cannot be separated by the whims of others, where every person has the opportunity to make their own choices about their life and future. And what role do you see yourself playing in creating that world? I intend to spend the rest of my life telling the story of what slavery really was, not the romanticized version that some people prefer to believe. I want to make sure that the sacrifices made by my friends and family are not forgotten, and that the lessons of our struggle are passed on to future generations. After her testimony, Abigail was approached by several abolitionists who wanted to arrange speaking tours throughout the North. Her story had captured the public imagination, and there was significant demand for her to share her experiences with audiences who had never heard first-hand accounts of slavery's brutalities. Frederick Douglass, the famous escaped slave and abolitionist speaker, met with Abigail privately after her congressional appearance. "Your testimony today was powerful," he told her. "You spoke truth to power in a way that few people have the courage to do." Mr. Douglas, I simply told them what happened. The truth doesn't require courage. It only requires honesty. In a world built on lies about slavery, honesty does require courage. You've done something important here today. Your words will help change minds and hearts throughout the country. Over the following months, Abigail traveled extensively throughout the North, speaking to packed auditoriums about her experiences on Whitmore Plantation and during the escape to freedom. Her speeches were notable for their lack of sentimentality. She presented the facts of slavery without emotional manipulation, allowing the stark reality to speak for itself. In Boston, she addressed a crowd of over 2,000 people, including many prominent intellectuals and politicians. Some of you may wonder, she told the audience, whether the violence of our rebellion was necessary. You may ask whether we could have found a peaceful solution to our situation. I ask you in return, what peaceful solution exists when one human being owns another? What negotiation is possible between master and slave? Violence was not our first choice, it was our only choice. The impact of her speaking tour was significant. Newspapers throughout the North published excerpts from her speeches, and her story became a rallying cry for immediate emancipation. When President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, many credited Abigail's testimony as one of the factors that had influenced his decision. But perhaps the most important aspect of Abigail's post-rebellion life was her role as a mother and educator. She had established a small school for freed slaves in Washington, D.C., where she taught reading, writing, and arithmetic to children and adults who had been denied education under slavery. Her son Moses was among her first students, and she was determined that he would grow up with all the opportunities that had been denied to her. Education is the key to true freedom, she often told her students. They can take away your possessions, they can restrict your movements, but they cannot take away what you know. Knowledge is the one thing that belongs to you alone. As the Civil War progressed and Union victory became increasingly likely, Abigail began to think about the challenges that would face freed slaves after emancipation. She understood that legal freedom would not automatically translate into economic or social equality, and she worked tirelessly to prepare her community for the struggles ahead. In 1865, when news arrived that the war had ended and slavery had been abolished throughout the United States, Abigail gathered her students and community members for a celebration that was both joyful and sobering. Today, we celebrate the end of slavery, she told the assembled crowd. But we must also remember that freedom is not a destination. It is a journey. The work of building a truly just society is just beginning, and it will require the same courage and determination that we showed during our escape from bondage. 10 years after the rebellion at Whitmore Plantation, Abigail published her memoirs titled From Bondage to Freedom, The True Story of a Slave Rebellion. The book became a bestseller and was translated into multiple languages, spreading her story throughout the world and inspiring other oppressed peoples in their struggles for freedom. In the final chapter of her memoirs, Abigail reflected on the price that had been paid for freedom and the responsibility that came with it. The 33 people who died during our escape from slavery did not die in vain, she wrote. They died so that others might live free, and their sacrifice has meaning only if we use our freedom to build a better world for all people. We who survived carry the obligation to honor their memory by working for justice, equality, and human dignity for all. Abigail lived to see the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the Jim Crow era, and she spent her final years fighting against the new forms of oppression that emerged to replace slavery. She died in 1895, at the age of 62, surrounded by her son Moses, now a successful lawyer and civil rights activist, and dozens of former students who had gone on to become teachers, ministers, and leaders in their communities. Her funeral was attended by thousands of people, including many who had never met her but had been inspired by her story. Frederick Douglass, now an old man himself, delivered the eulogy, saying, "Abigail showed us that freedom is not something that can be given, it must be taken. She showed us that the human spirit cannot be broken, no matter how great the oppression. And she showed us that one person, armed with courage and determination, can change the course of history." The rebellion at Whitmore Plantation had lasted only a few hours, but its impact echoed through the decades that followed. Abigail's story became a symbol of resistance and hope, proof that even in the darkest circumstances, the human desire for freedom cannot be extinguished. The end. Important notice. This story is completely fictional and created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, situations, and circumstances are products of imagination and do not represent real people, living or dead, or real events. Any similarity to actual people or situations is purely coincidental. This powerful work of historical fiction explores themes of resistance, freedom, sacrifice, and the human cost of oppression. Through Abigail's story, it examines the moral complexities of violent resistance against systematic injustice, the price of freedom, and the ongoing struggle for human dignity and equality. The narrative demonstrates how individual acts of courage can inspire broader social change, and how the fight for justice often requires tremendous personal sacrifice.